The scent of wilting roses, once meant to signify purity and new beginnings, now clung to her like a shroud, a bitter perfume for a heart left to rot on the altar of public shame. Ilara stood, a porcelain doll shattered in plain sight, the white lace of her gown a stark mockery against the crimson blush of her humiliation. Each echoing tick of the church clock was a hammer blow, driving deeper the nail of her abandonment, while the hushed whispers of the gathered townspeople, a chorus of pity and condemnation, swirled around her like a venomous fog, the air, thick with unfulfilled promises, and the stench of burning beeswax candles, pressed down, suffocating. Her groom, Elias, had vanished as if swallowed by the very earth, leaving behind only the cold stone of the chapel and the chill of betrayal in her bones. A tremor ran through her, not of cold, but of a profound, shattering emptiness. Her hands, clutched tightly around a wilted bouquet, trembled with the force of unshed tears. This was not just a broken engagement. This was a public execution of her spirit, a brand seared onto her very being that the judging eyes of Havenwood would never let her forget. The silence that followed the last gasps of surprise was more deafening than any scream, a chasm that swallowed her future whole. She imagined the gossip already taking flight, carried on the cruel wind, reaching every porch and saloon in town, each word a shard of glass aimed at her already bleeding soul. How could a man promise forever, swear devotion before God and community, then simply evaporate? The irony was a biting thing, twisting in her gut. She, Ilara Vance, once the town's quiet beauty, now its most spectacular failure, a monument to a love that never truly existed. Her life, once a neatly woven tapestry of predictable days and modest dreams, had unraveled in a single, devastating moment, leaving behind loose threads and gaping holes. The weight of Havenwood's collective gaze, heavy and critical, promised a future of isolation, a solitary existence shrouded in the memory of this day. She felt the chill of the coming years, a long, drawn-out winter of the heart, stretching endlessly before her. The world, once vibrant, had narrowed to the dusty confines of this small, unforgiving chapel. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. Ilara did not flee. She stood, rooted, a statue carved from despair, enduring the long, agonizing minutes after the last of the gawkers had finally dispersed, their morbid curiosity satisfied. The emptiness of the church was a physical weight, pressing in on her, amplifying the silence until it roared in her ears. Dust motes danced in the sliver of sunlight piercing the stained glass window, a fleeting beauty she could not appreciate, for her vision was blurred by a veil of sorrow that had yet to solidify into tears. She heard the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the faint laughter from the saloon, sounds of a world that continued its indifferent dance while hers had crumbled to ash. The air grew stale with the scent of forgotten hopes, the wilting roses in her grasp mimicking the death of her own aspirations. Each breath was a shallow, painful gasp, a testament to her struggle for survival amidst the ruins of her future. Hours later, the sun dipping towards the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, a shadow fell across the church threshold. It was not Elias. It was a man woven from grit and silence, a stranger to Havenwood, yet somehow intimately familiar with the raw edges of a broken world. His silhouette, framed by the dying light, was stark, imposing, his wide-brimmed hat obscuring much of his face. But even from a distance, the scars that marred one side of his jawline were visible, a roadmap of past violence or profound hardship. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, each step deliberate, unnerving. The air shifted, thick with a new kind of tension, electric and unsettling. Ilara, numb with grief, barely registered his presence beyond a flicker of primal fear. Her mind was a fractured landscape, replaying Elias's last words, his stolen glances, the deceit woven into every kiss. She tasted the bitter tang of betrayal on her tongue, a constant reminder of how easily she had been discarded, a vessel emptied of purpose. The shame was a living entity, coiling in her gut, whispering promises of a desolate future. She was the forgotten bride, a discarded relic in a town that thrived on gossip and judgment. The thought of facing the relentless stares, the veiled pity, The outright contempt was more terrifying than any physical pain. She wished she could melt into the stone, become one with the desolate silence of the abandoned church, disappear completely from a world that had so cruelly exposed her vulnerability. This man, this silent stranger, was merely another fleeting shadow in her unfolding nightmare. He watched her, a stillness in his posture that spoke of long roads traveled and many battles fought. The light, now a bruised violet, caught the metallic glint of the buckles on his holster, hinting at a profession that left little room for sentiment. He did not speak, nor did he approach further than the first few pews, choosing instead to observe her like a wild creature, assessing her stillness, her brokenness. His presence, an anomaly in the heart of Havenwood, was unsettling. Alara finally lifted her gaze, her eyes, once sparkling with youthful dreams, now dulled to the color of ash. She saw not pity in his shadowed face, but something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps recognition, a shared understanding of deep wounds, or perhaps merely the detached curiosity of a weary traveler. His silence was a different kind of burden than the town's judgmental whispers. It was a heavy cloak, hinting at untold stories and hidden depths. He seemed to carry the weight of distant horizons, of forgotten skirmishes, etched into the very lines of his lean, hardened body. The air between them hummed with unspoken tension, a fragile bridge connecting two solitary souls marooned in the vast emptiness of the world. He finally broke the silence, his voice a low rasp, like gravel shifting under a heavy boot. "You ain't gonna stand here till the dust claims you, girl." It was not a question, but a statement, blunt and without preamble. His eyes, the color of flint, held a strange, unsettling clarity as they fixed on her, assessing her fragility, her brokenness. Alara flinched, not from malice in his tone, but from the raw directness of his words, cutting through the haze of her grief. It was the first honest statement she had heard since the morning, a stark contrast to the saccharine platitudes and hushed condolences offered by the townsfolk. "What else is there?" she whispered, her voice a reedy whisper, barely audible above the rising evening breeze. The question hung in the air, a desperate plea for an answer she didn't believe existed. He took a slow step forward, then another, until he stood just a few paces from the altar, close enough for her to see the faint network of fine lines around his eyes, the deep-seated weariness that no amount of rest could erase. "There's always something else," he countered, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on the wilting roses in her hands, a stark metaphor for her ruined hopes. He didn't offer comfort or false sympathy, but a hard, unyielding truth. "Rot's a slow death, quicker to burn." His words, devoid of sentimentality, held a strange, brutal resonance. They spoke of a world she had only ever glimpsed from afar, a world of stark choices and grim realities, a world where the faint-hearted withered. He wasn't offering salvation, but a path of survival, one steeped in a kind of defiance she had never known. The metaphor of burning, of consuming the pain, rather than letting it consume her, echoed in the hollow chambers of her shattered heart. A strange flicker, a tiny spark of something akin to curiosity, ignited within her, piercing the thick fog of despair. Who was this man, this scarred stranger, who spoke with such brutal honesty? What fires had he endured to forge such a hardened resolve? The town of Havenwood, a cluster of wooden buildings clinging precariously to the edge of the vast, indifferent prairie, had always prided itself on its rigid moral code, its neatly drawn lines between right and wrong. Alara, though she never explicitly questioned it, felt the suffocating weight of this unspoken doctrine. She remembered the day Elias first rode into town, a dashing figure on a fine bay mare, his easy smile and confident swagger captivating everyone, including her. Her mother, a stern woman whose piety was her armor, had deemed him a good match, a man of property and promise. But there were whispers, too, faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in a distant wind. Whispers of Elias's business dealings, of his shrewdness bordering on ruthlessness, of his quick temper when crossed. Alara, blinded by the sheen of affection and the dream of security, had dismissed them as mere gossip, the petty jealousies of a small town. Now, standing before this scarred man, the truth felt as palpable as the dust beneath her bare feet. Elias hadn't abandoned her out of cowardice alone. Though cowardice certainly played its part, he had abandoned her because a secret, far more potent than any societal judgment, had emerged. A memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through Elara's numbed mind. A week before the wedding, a heated argument between Elias and a gaunt, furious-looking man had erupted in the street outside the general store. Voices had been low, but the tension had crackled like dry kindling. Elias had gone pale, his confident facade cracking, a flicker of fear in his eyes. The man, a stranger to Elara, had spoken of debts and consequences, his words laced with a chilling menace. Elias had dismissed it later, with a forced laugh, as a misunderstanding, a distant business acquaintance. But Elara now saw the lie in his eyes, the frantic energy that had consumed him in the days leading up to the wedding. He had been fleeing something, not just her. Her naive belief in his purity had been her undoing. The realization was a fresh wound, layered on top of the old ones, deepening the sense of betrayal. He hadn't just rejected her, he had used her as a shield, a distraction, before shedding her like an inconvenient skin. The town, in its collective judgment, hadn't seen the real Elias, only the charming veneer he presented, and in doing so, had inadvertently blessed her union with a viper. The harshness of the stranger's presence, the quiet strength emanating from him, offered a strange counterpoint to Elias's carefully constructed deceit. The gunslinger, who simply called himself Silas, watched Elara, a quiet contemplation in his scarred face. He had seen women like her before, broken by circumstance, swallowed by despair. But there was a fragility in her, a porcelain delicacy, that stirred something within him, a flicker of a forgotten protectorate. He spoke again, his voice softer this time, though still rough. "You got kin here?" The question was direct, practical, devoid of pity, yet it held a strange undercurrent of concern. Elara shook her head, a slow, weary motion. "My mother passed last year. My father, he's been gone for a long time." She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone, in a town that would now view her as damaged goods. Silas considered this, his gaze drifting to the empty church, then back to the dust motes dancing in the fading light. "This town ain't gonna offer you much more than empty promises and colder shoulders," he stated. A grim truth, born of experience. He knew the way small towns worked, how quickly they turned on those who defied their narrow expectations. He then nodded towards the entrance, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture. "Come on, there's a place outside of town. Old Miller's cabin. Empty now, better than rot." It wasn't an invitation, but an instruction, a stark offer of survival. No grand gestures, no declarations of rescue, just a pragmatic hand extended in the face of despair. Elara hesitated, fear warring with a desperate, primal need for escape. This man was a stranger, a scarred enigma, perhaps dangerous, but Havenwood, with its judging eyes and suffocating morality, felt like a cage closing in. The thought of facing another dawn in this town, bathed in the lingering scent of her public humiliation, was unbearable. She looked at the wilted bouquet in her hand, the symbol of her shattered dream, and then at Silas, his silhouette stark against the fading light, an unreadable challenge. He wasn't offering her a new life, perhaps not even safety, but he offered her a chance to move, to breathe, to escape the suffocating grip of her past. It was a terrifying leap into the unknown, but the alternative was a slow, agonizing suffocation. Her gaze met his, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond weariness in his eyes, a glint of an old, untamed resilience. Elara followed him, her wedding gown trailing in the dust, a stark white banner of her shame against the darkening prairie. The journey to Miller's cabin was silent, punctuated only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant hoot of an owl. Silas drove with an unsettling focus, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand resting casually near the grip of his pistol. He was a creature of vigilance, accustomed to dangers lurking in the shadows, a stark contrast to the sheltered life she had known. The cabin itself was small, dilapidated, perched precariously on a rocky outcrop, overlooking a dry riverbed. Its broken windows were like empty eyes staring out at the vast, indifferent landscape. Yet, to Elara, it felt like a sanctuary, a desperate haven from the judging eyes of Havenwood. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a fitting aroma for her current state. Silas simply gestured to the cot in the corner. "Water's in the bucket. Firewood's outside." His instructions were terse, his movements efficient as he unrolled a bedroll near the door. A silent sentinel. He offered no false comforts, no empty words of solace. And in his quiet practicality, Ilara found a strange kind of peace. It was a grounded reality, far removed from the romanticized lies she had once clung to. As the days bled into weeks, Ilara began to piece together fragments of Silas's life, not through direct confession, but through observation. He was a man of routines, of silent vigilance. He would ride out at dawn, returning with a rabbit or a deer, his aim deadly precise. He would sit for hours, cleaning his pistol, his movements almost ritualistic. A man intimately acquainted with the tools of violence. He never spoke of his past, but the scars on his face, the haunted look in his eyes, spoke volumes of battles fought and losses sustained. One evening, as she tended a small cooking fire, a question escaped her lips, born of a desperate need to understand this silent guardian. Why did you help me?" His answer was slow in coming. His gaze fixed on the flickering flames, saw a reflection. His voice was low, laced with an old pain. "Once knew a man who let himself rot. Ain't a pretty sight." The words hung in the air, laden with unspoken stories, a glimpse into his own haunted past. It was a moment of stark vulnerability, revealing a hidden depth beneath his hardened exterior. His words weren't a plea for pity, but a quiet confession, a revelation of a shared understanding of profound despair. It was the first true bridge built between them, not of comfort or affection, but of shared brokenness. The cabin, once a symbol of her desolate isolation, now held the fragile hope of an unlikely connection, a quiet understanding growing in the desolate landscape of her new life. The first month at Miller's cabin was a slow, painful shedding of Ilara's old skin. The societal expectations, the whispered judgments, the saccharine promises of a future that never was, all of it began to peel away, leaving a raw, vulnerable core. Silas, through his silent, unwavering presence, became an anchor in the storm of her despair. He never interrogated her, never pressed for explanations, allowing her grief to run its course without judgment. His occasional, terse advice focused on survival: how to track, how to identify edible plants, how to load a rifle. He taught her to shoot, his scarred hand guiding hers, the cold steel of the rifle, a harsh, yet oddly comforting, weight in her grasp. The crack of the gun, sharp and defiant, was a release, an echo of the anger and frustration she had suppressed for so long. She found a strange solace in the stark realities of survival, a brutal beauty in the desert's indifference. One crisp morning, as the sun painted the sky in hues of fiery orange, Ilara spotted a rider approaching the cabin, silhouetted against the rising sun. Her heart leaped, a flicker of panic. It was Elias. Her breath hitched in her throat, a cold dread seizing her. Silas, ever vigilant, was already standing, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His face was a mask of grim resolve. Elias rode up, his usual confident swagger replaced by a nervous energy. He dismounted, his eyes darting between Ilara and Silas, a flicker of surprise and apprehension in his gaze. "Ilara," he began, his voice surprisingly soft, attempting to evoke a familiarity that had long since curdled into resentment. "I've come for you." Ilara's gaze hardened. The man before her was no longer the charming suitor she had once adored, but a hollow shell of deceit. "You left me to rot," she stated, her voice surprisingly steady, though a tremor ran through her. "You come back now, after the world's seen me cast aside?" Elias shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to Silas, who remained silent, a formidable, watchful presence. "It wasn't like that, Ilara. There were complications." His words were evasive, flimsy excuses clinging to a decaying truth. He spoke of business troubles, of enemies, of needing to secure their future before he could claim her. But his eyes, shifting and uncertain, betrayed the lie. The veil had lifted. Ilara saw him for what he was: a coward, a manipulator, a man who would abandon anyone to save his own skin. The air crackled with unspoken tension. the silence between Elias's flimsy explanations and Ilara's simmering rage growing heavy, thick with the weight of shattered trust. Silas remained impassive, a silent judge. The escalating tension between Elias and Ilara was palpable, stretching the thin air of the cabin like a taut wire. Elias, sensing the shift in Ilara, the hardened resolve in her eyes, abandoned his gentle pretense. His voice grew sharper, a frustrated edge creeping in. "You can't stay here, Ilara? What would people say? This is a disgrace." "With him?" He gestured vaguely at Silas, contempt curling his lip. The old societal fears, the judgmental whispers of Havenwood, were his weapons, aimed to break her down, to shame her back into submission. But Ilara was no longer the fragile girl he had abandoned. She had seen the raw face of survival, experienced the brutal honesty of the wilderness, and Elias's petty concerns now seemed distant, hollow. "People have already said what they will," Ilara retorted, her voice clear and strong, cutting through his bluster. "And I don't care." The words, simple yet defiant, carried the weight of her transformation. Elias paled, truly seeing the stranger she had become, a woman forged in the crucible of his betrayal. He took a step back, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. He tried another tack, a desperate plea for the future he envisioned, a future where she would resume her role as his quiet, obedient wife. "But our life, Ilara, the reputation, I have prospects, a business. We could still have everything." His words were hollow, devoid of any genuine affection, merely a reflection of his own ego and desire for public appearances. Silas, who had remained a silent, watchful presence, finally spoke, his voice low, gravelly, and laced with a quiet menace that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. "You spoke of complications," he said, stepping forward, his movements fluid and dangerous, "and enemies." His eyes, flint hard, bore into Elias's. "Care to share what kind of complications lead a man to leave a woman at the altar?" Elias stammered, his gaze darting nervously. It's a private matter." "Business," Silas scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "Business that runs when the stakes get high. Cowardice is what it is." The accusation hung heavy in the air, undeniable. Elias's face flushed with a mixture of shame and fury. The silent threat, the raw power emanating from Silas, was a stark contrast to Elias's carefully cultivated image of a successful businessman. The confrontation was no longer just about Ilara. It was about the fundamental difference between the two men, one embodying survival and raw truth, the other, artifice and societal pretense. Elias, cornered and desperate, finally let slip the full extent of his deceit, driven by Silas's relentless unspoken pressure. "Fine. It was about the land, damn it," he spat, his composure finally shattering. "Old man Hemlock's claim. I was trying to buy him out, but he wouldn't budge. Turns out he had a son, a damn drifter, a gunslinger. He heard I was pressuring his father, saw me as a threat. He came to town, made it clear if I went through with the wedding, if I laid claim to anything connected to the Hemlock name, there'd be consequences." Elias's eyes, wide with fear, suddenly made sense. He hadn't abandoned Ilara out of a sudden change of heart. He had abandoned her because marrying her meant inheriting a dangerous vendetta. Her heart, already bruised, twisted anew. She was a pawn, a casualty in a land dispute, collateral damage in Elias's greedy schemes. Silas's face, usually impassive, twitched, a barely perceptible flicker of recognition crossing his features. "Hemlock," he repeated, the name a whisper, loaded with an unrevealed history. A flashback, swift and brutal, assaulted Silas's mind. A sun-baked street, the smell of cordite thick in the air, the cold weight of a pistol in his hand, and the dying gasp of a man, his eyes wide with surprise, before his body slumped to the dusty ground. He remembered the face of the man, a young, earnest face, perhaps too eager, too confident. His own hands, steady and unyielding then, now felt a phantom tremor. The scars on Silas's jaw, a testament to that grim past, throbbed with a dull ache. He had killed that man, a drifter who had challenged him, who had sought to make a name for himself by facing a man already infamous. He had seen the name Hemlock on the man's deed. A small, worn paper tucked into his pocket. A deep, unsettling irony settled upon Silas. The man he killed had been the son of the very man Elias was trying to swindle. This unforeseen connection, this thread of past violence and present deceit, wove a complex tapestry of fate. He had taken a life, inadvertently setting in motion a chain of events that led Elias to abandon Alara, and Alara to his own solitary cabin. The past, he realized, was never truly buried. It simply lay in wait, ready to resurface, its tendrils reaching into the most unexpected corners of one's present. The revelation of Elias's treachery, and the unspoken connection to Silas's own past, crackled like lightning in the small cabin. Alara stared at Elias, a cold, hard glint in her eyes. "So it wasn't fear of a ruined reputation," she stated, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, "but fear of a bullet. You valued your life more than my dignity, my future, everything." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Elias stammered, trying to defend himself, but his words were hollow, lacking any shred of conviction. The man before her was a stranger, stripped of his charming facade, revealing only a craven self-preservation. Silas stepped forward, his presence growing, filling the small space with an unnerving authority. His hand, as if by instinct, rested on the hilt of his pistol. "The Hemlock claim," he mused aloud, his voice low, almost a whisper, yet it resonated with an undeniable power. "I've heard tell of it. Valuable land, and a son who wouldn't let it go." His gaze, flinty and unwavering, fixed on Elias. "You tried to swindle an old man, then ran like a dog when his kin came calling." The words were a condemnation, a challenge that went beyond Elara's pain. Elias, sensing the shift in the air, the cold, dangerous current emanating from Silas, finally broke. He backed away, stumbling towards the door, his bravado utterly evaporated. "This is madness! You're both insane!" he spat, fear twisting his features. "Havenwood will hear of this. You'll be ruined, Alara. And you," he turned his venomous gaze to Silas, "you'll hang for this." Silas merely watched him, a faint, humorless smile playing on his lips. "Havenwood can say what it likes, and I've seen enough ropes to know a real threat from a coward's bluff." Elias, seeing the futility of his threats, the impenetrable resolve in Silas's eyes, turned and bolted, scrambling onto his horse and riding away in a cloud of dust, leaving nothing but the echoes of his empty words. The cabin settled back into a tense silence, but this time it was different. The air was cleansed, rid of the lies, leaving behind a stark, unsettling truth. Alara looked at Silas, her eyes questioning. He had protected her, not with comforting words, but with an unyielding presence that had stripped bare her tormentor. The battle was won, but the aftermath lingered, and a new tension, unspoken, stretched between them. The dust cloud raised by Elias's retreating horse settled, leaving behind a stark clarity in the desert air. Alara looked at Silas, truly looked at him, seeing beyond the scars and the weary eyes to the complex man beneath. He had stood for her, not as a knight, but as a force of nature, blunt and uncompromising. "Hemlock," she finally said, her voice soft, tentative, testing the name. "You knew him, didn't you?" Silas was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, a landscape that held countless memories. "I knew a man named Hemlock," he finally affirmed, his voice rougher than usual. "A young one, full of fire." He paused, and then with a slow, deliberate cadence, he began to speak, the words emerging like stones from a deep well. He recounted the tale of a dusty saloon in a nameless town, a card game gone sour, a challenge issued, and a quick, brutal draw. The man he killed, he explained, was indeed the son of the old man Elias had sought to exploit. "He was trying to make a name for himself," Silas said, his voice laced with a bitter irony. "Challenged the wrong man? I didn't know he had an ailing father, or that he was trying to hold on to his family's land. Just another hothead looking for trouble." But even as he spoke, Alara sensed the deeper layers, the unspoken regret in his tone. The scars on his jaw, she realized, were not just from that fight, but from a lifetime of such encounters. a chronicle of violence and self-preservation. He had lived by the gun, his existence a harsh tapestry woven with threads of blood and regret. "That's why I helped you," he finally admitted, his gaze meeting hers, a raw vulnerability in his eyes. "Saw you letting the bitterness take hold. Saw a reflection of what I'd almost become, a ghost of a man, haunted by what he'd done or what he'd failed to do." The confession hung in the air, a profound revelation of his morally ambiguous past and the unexpected undercurrent of remorse that fueled his present actions. He wasn't a hero, but a man burdened by his own history, seeking a quiet, unacknowledged form of redemption. His willingness to speak of his past, even in its grim reality, forged a new, deeper connection between them, born not of innocence, but of shared brokenness and a desperate, quiet hope for something more. The air around the cabin, once filled with the ghosts of Ilara's past, now carried the heavy weight of Silas's confessions. The silence between them after his story was not empty, but thick with understanding, a profound resonance. Ilara, no longer the naive bride, looked at the hardened lines of his face, the scars that spoke of a brutal existence, and saw not a villain, but a man trapped by the echoes of his past, a soul seeking a form of quiet penance. His life had been a series of stark choices, often violent, but beneath the rough exterior, she sensed a deep-seated weariness, a yearning for peace he perhaps hadn't known how to articulate. A new threat, however, soon cast its shadow over their fragile sanctuary. Elias, consumed by wounded pride and a desperate need for revenge, had not gone quietly. News of his humiliation at the cabin had spread through Havenwood like wildfire. Twisted and distorted by the town's judgmental tongues, they painted Ilara as a fallen woman, swayed by a dangerous outlaw, and Silas as a ruthless killer who had stolen her. Elias, fueling the fire, had convinced a small posse of local men, eager to prove their righteousness and claim a bounty, to ride out to the cabin. Their horses kicked up dust on the horizon, a grim procession under the harsh midday sun. Ilara saw them first, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silas simply nodded, his face grim, his hand already on his pistol. He moved with a practiced calm, checking his rifle, his movements fluid and efficient. "They're not after justice," he stated, his voice flat. "They're after a story, a scalp, and a quick reputation." He didn't ask her to leave, didn't offer her an escape route. He simply prepared for the inevitable. A man resigned to the battles his past had set in motion. The confrontation was upon them, the culmination of Elias's betrayal, Havenwood's judgment, and Silas's burdened history. The cabin, once a haven, was now a battleground. The stakes were no longer just Ilara's dignity, but their very lives, intertwined now in a dangerous dance with destiny. The sun beat down relentlessly, mirroring the escalating tension, promising a harsh reckoning under the unforgiving western sky. The silence was punctuated only by the distant thud of hooves, growing steadily louder, drumming a grim rhythm of impending violence. The posse approached, their faces grim, their rifles glinting in the harsh sun. At their head was Jebediah Stone, the town's self-appointed moral guardian, a man whose righteousness was as broad as his girth. "Silas," he bellowed, his voice booming across the dry riverbed. "We know what you are, and we know you've taken Ilara Vance against her will. Surrender now, and no more blood has to be spilled." His words were a theatrical performance, meant to justify their actions, to frame Silas as the villain and themselves as the valiant protectors of Havenwood's virtue. Silas stepped out onto the cabin porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands, his posture radiating a quiet, unyielding defiance. Ilara stood beside him, her gaze unwavering, a silent testament to her allegiance. "She's here by her own choice," Silas stated, his voice clear, cutting through the bluster. "And I ain't taking nothing that wasn't freely given." Jebediah scoffed, his eyes narrowed in contempt. "A lie. You're a gunslinger, a murderer. You've ruined that girl." Elias, lurking behind the posse, piped up, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and bravado. "He forced her. He threatens me. He's a menace." The scene was set for a brutal confrontation, the emotional climax of their intertwined destinies. Silas raised his rifle, not to aim, but as a gesture of warning. This ain't your fight, Stone. It's between a man and his conscience, and a woman who's finally seen the truth. His words carried a profound weight, a challenge to the very foundation of Havenwood's self-righteous judgment. The air thickened with unspoken tension, the silence heavy with the promise of violence. The men of the posse shifted uncomfortably, their resolve wavering under Silas's unyielding gaze. They had come for a quick victory, a simple capture, not a complex moral dilemma. The raw, unfiltered truth emanating from Silas, starkly contrasting Elias's whining, had begun to erode their carefully constructed narrative of good versus evil. The moment stretched, fraught with danger, each second a testament to the lives hanging in the balance. The sun beat down, turning the dust to a shimmering haze around the cabin, an almost surreal backdrop to the unfolding drama. Jebediah Stone, unwilling to back down, yet hesitating to initiate outright bloodshed against a man of Silas's reputation, finally resorted to a familiar tactic. "Think of your soul, girl," he roared, pointing his finger at Elara. "Living with a man like this, you'll be cast out, forever damned." His words were meant to break her, to appeal to the deep-seated fears of societal excommunication that had once governed her life. But Elara, transformed by the crucible of abandonment and survival, met his gaze with a startling defiance. Her voice, usually soft, rang out with a newfound strength, clear and unwavering. "My soul, Mr. Stone, is mine to answer for, and I tell you this, I found more honesty in a scarred man's silence than in all the pious words this town has ever spoken." Her gaze flickered to Elias, who flinched, then back to Silas, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I'd rather be damned by your judgment than live another day by your lies." Her words were a powerful counter-declaration, a stark rejection of the hypocrisy that had sought to destroy her. She took a deliberate step closer to Silas, her shoulder brushing his, a silent, defiant act of solidarity. The gesture was a raw, emotional climax, a pivot point in her journey, a public declaration of her broken but resilient spirit. Silas, sensing her unwavering resolve, lowered his rifle slightly, not in surrender, but in a profound acceptance. His eyes, usually wary, softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at her. He didn't need to speak. Her declaration was his answer, his vindication against the town's judgment. The posse, stunned by Elara's unexpected courage, hesitated. Jebediah's face was a mask of disbelief, his authority undermined. The carefully constructed narrative of Silas as a monster and Elara as his helpless victim had shattered. The confrontation had turned, not into a battle of bullets, but a battle of wills, a raw, undeniable clash between rigid societal norms and an individual's desperate quest for truth and belonging. The tension, though still present, had shifted, settling into a different kind of silence, one tinged with awe and grudging respect from some of the onlookers. The standoff ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Jebediah Stone, his self-righteous authority crumbling under the weight of Elara's defiant words and Silas's unyielding presence, finally lowered his rifle. The other men in the posse, sensing their leader's defeat, followed suit, their bravado evaporating in the face of such raw, unvarnished truth. Elias, seeing his last hope of revenge dissipate, slunk away, retreating into the anonymity of the retreating posse, his figure growing smaller and more insignificant with each passing moment. The sun, now beginning its slow descent, cast long, distorted shadows across the land, mirroring the distorted realities that had just been exposed. The cabin settled back into a fragile peace, yet it was a different peace than before. The air was no longer thick with the suffocating burden of unspoken pain or looming threat. It was lighter, clearer, cleansed by the storm they had weathered together. Elara and Silas stood on the porch, watching the last of the posse disappear, their silence now one of shared understanding, a quiet comfort that transcended words. The symbols of their past, Elara's abandoned gown, Silas's scarred face, remained, but their meaning had subtly shifted. They were no longer solely marks of shame or violence, but testaments to resilience, to the fires they had endured, and the unlikely bond they had forged in the ashes. The future remained uncertain, as it always did in the vast, unforgiving West, but the suffocating grip of Havenwood's judgment had loosened. Elara knew she might never be truly accepted back into conventional society, but she also knew she no longer yearned for it. She had found a different kind of home, not in a house of worship or a husband's promise, but in the desolate beauty of the wilderness and the quiet strength of a man who saw her not as a broken doll, but as a kindred spirit. Silas, for his part, found a quiet reprieve from his haunted past, a chance to shed the burden of constant vigilance, replaced by a shared vulnerability. The scars on his face remained, a stark reminder of his life, but they no longer felt like a brand of shame. He had found a reason to stay, a fragile, hard-won peace with a woman who understood the language of silence and the weight of unspoken truths. Hope, not a grand, sweeping tide, but a quiet, tenacious sprout, had begun to push through the parched earth of their lives, promising a future, however challenging, that was truly their own.